This common healthy habit is killing your stem cells every day. I did this for years. For many years, I genuinely thought I was doing the best thing for my body. I was committed to my fitness routine, making conscious choices about what I ate, and generally staying active. I even convinced myself that the occasional sleepless night or the inherent stress of running my own practice was simply the price of a productive life. What I didn't realize, what no one had explained to me, and what many doctors still aren't telling their patients today, is that 3 of the habits I believed were protecting me were actually speeding up the breakdown of the very cells my body relies on to heal, renew, and function effectively as I get older. I'm talking about your own adult stem cells, not the embryonic kind you might have heard debated in the news. These are the stem cells that are currently living within your bone marrow, your muscles, your intestinal lining, and your brain. They are the essential workers responsible for rebuilding damaged tissues, generating new blood cells, maintaining your immune system, and keeping the complex machinery of your body running smoothly decade after decade. The research I've been reviewing over the past several years, which is rigorous, peer-reviewed, and published in respected journals like Cell Stem Cell, the Journal of Experimental Medicine, and Nature Communications, has fundamentally changed how I approach everyday decisions about my health. It turns out that a significant number of people, roughly 37% of those over 60 in the United States, are experiencing a decline in their stem cell function without even realizing it. This decline can manifest in various ways: persistent fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, wounds that take much longer to heal than they used to, a slower and less effective immune system, and a loss of muscle mass that seems resistant to any amount of protein or exercise. These aren't isolated issues with separate causes. They are often different symptoms of the same underlying problem: an aging stem cell population that is being depleted faster than it should be due to habits that on the surface appear healthy. Before I go any further, and I want to emphasize this because it's important, everything I'm about to share is for educational purposes. It's based on published scientific research and is intended to provide you with a framework for understanding your own biology. It's not a substitute for professional medical advice. If you are taking medications, have a cardiovascular condition, diabetes, or any autoimmune diagnosis, please discuss this information with your doctor before making any changes to your routine. What I'm offering here is information. How you use it should be a conversation with someone who knows your complete medical history. If you find these kinds of discussions valuable, subscribing helps me continue this research and bring it to you. But please, no pressure at all. Let's dive into what the science actually reveals. My decision to focus specifically on habits that seem healthy is deliberate. If I told you that smoking destroys stem cells, you would likely nod and move on because you already know smoking is harmful. What's more useful, and frankly more alarming, is understanding that a form of exercise millions of people over 50 are doing with the specific intention of protecting their health might actually be causing measurable damage to their stem cell reserves, or that a food currently in your refrigerator, perhaps labeled whole grain or natural or high protein, is likely classified as an ultra-processed food, and 2 major national studies from 2024 show that consuming it accelerates your biological aging at a quantifiable rate, or that the fragmented sleep you've accepted as normal because you're over 50, 55, or 70, just how sleep is now, isn't harmless. It's actively reshaping the genetic machinery of your blood stem cells in ways that a weekend of good sleep won't undo. The science behind this isn't speculative. It's coming from leading institutions like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, and from some of the largest population studies ever conducted on human aging. What makes this particularly urgent for individuals in their 50s, 60s, and 70s is a biological reality that younger people don't have to contend with. By the age of 50, your stem cell reserve has already naturally declined. This isn't because you've done anything wrong. It's simply a consequence of biology. Estimates suggest that by the time you reach 50, the regenerative capacity of your hematopoietic stem cells, those in your bone marrow responsible for producing all your blood and immune cells, has already dropped by 30% to 40% compared to your 20s. This is your baseline, even before any of the habits we'll discuss come into play. The reason this is so significant is that when your stem cell reserve is already reduced, any additional stressor, any habit that hastens stem cell depletion or dysfunction, has a much more profound effect than it would on a 25-year-old. You have less room for error, which means the information in this discussion is not merely academic. It's practical and time-sensitive. Let me start by delving into the research itself, so you can see where these conclusions originate. In 2022, a collaborative team from the Harvard STEM, Cell Institute, Columbia University, and Massachusetts General Hospital published a study in the Journal of Experimental Medicine. I consider this one of the most important, yet least discussed papers on aging from the last decade. Their research focused on a seemingly simple question: what exactly does disrupted sleep do to your blood stem cells at a genetic level beyond affecting energy levels or mood? Their findings were striking. Sleep disruption doesn't just make stem cells tired, it fundamentally restructures their epigenome. To understand this, think of your DNA as a library of instruction manuals. The epigenome is like a system of flags and bookmarks that determines which manuals are opened and read, and which remain on the shelf. Chronic and accumulated sleep disruption, the kind that tens of millions of adults over 50 experience as just a normal part of life, essentially reprograms these flags. It alters which genetic instructions your stem cells are accessing, pushing them towards abnormal growth patterns and an exaggerated inflammatory response. In essence, it doesn't just slow them down, it changes their function. What truly made me pause and reread the paper multiple times was the discovery that recovery sleep did not fully reverse this damage. The epigenetic changes persisted. The researchers observed what happened even after normal sleep resumed, and the stem cells did not return to their previous baseline state. The reprogramming was durable. This built upon earlier research from 2015 published in Nature Communications by Rolls and colleagues, which had already demonstrated that sleep deprivation in donor animals significantly reduced the ability of transplanted hematopoietic stem cells to engraft in recipients. They identified a specific microRNA, MyR19B, which sleep deprivation suppressed. This suppression led to an increase in certain genes that hindered the stem cell's ability to migrate to the bone marrow and establish themselves. The 2022 Harvard study added a crucial layer by showing that this wasn't a temporary suppression, but a lasting reprogramming. For someone in their 50s or 60s, this has direct implications. You likely sleep less soundly than you did at 30. You might wake up more often, take longer to fall back asleep, and spend less time in deep, slow-wave sleep, which is the most restorative stage. This is nearly universal in this age group and has often been treated clinically as a minor inconvenience, something to be managed with better sleep hygiene or perhaps a supplement. However, this research suggests we should consider whether this is actually a stem cell crisis unfolding slowly night after night over years and decades. The second area of research I want to discuss involves chronic stress. I'm not referring to the acute stress of a difficult conversation or a tight deadline, which resolves within hours and can even stimulate healthy cellular adaptation in moderate doses. I'm talking about the sustained, low-grade, always-on cortisol elevation that characterizes modern life for many people over 50. This is the kind of stress where the source isn't a single event, but a persistent condition. Financial worries, caregiving responsibilities, a career that never truly disconnects, a baseline of anxiety that has been present for so long you've stopped noticing it. A comprehensive review published in Brain, Behavior, and Immunity in 2022 synthesized decades of research on the molecular pathways connecting chronic psychological stress to accelerated biological aging. The straightforward conclusion is that chronic stress damages stem cells through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. Firstly, elevated cortisol over time directly increases DNA damage in various cell lines, including the progenitor cells that give rise to stem cells, while simultaneously impairing the efficiency of DNA repair systems. Your cells accumulate errors more quickly and fix them more slowly. Secondly, chronic cortisol elevation leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. Your cellular powerhouses begin to run inefficiently, producing more byproducts, including reactive oxygen species, which cause further cellular damage in a self-reinforcing cycle. Thirdly, and perhaps most insidiously, chronic stress shortens telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps at the ends of your chromosomes, and their length is one of the most reliable markers of biological age. Chronic stress reduces the activity of telomerase, the enzyme responsible for maintaining telomere length, and accelerates the rate at which telomeres shorten with each cell division. What makes this particularly significant for individuals over 50 is the research on adrenal aging. This research indicates that baseline cortisol levels are already higher in older adults, and the sensitivity of the HPA axis, the feedback system designed to shut down cortisol production once a stressor passes, becomes blunted with age. In a 25-year-old, cortisol spikes during stress and returns to baseline relatively quickly. In a 60-year-old, that spike tends to be higher, lasts longer, and the reset takes more time. The practical implication is that the same stressor results in a greater, longer-lasting cortisol burden in an older body, leading to faster damage accumulation. The margin for tolerating chronic stress, which was never generous, narrows further with each decade. A more recent review published in Frontiers in Aging in 2026 confirmed this specific molecular cascade. Chronic stress persistently activates the HPA axis, leading to sustained elevated glucocorticoids. These, in turn, drive mitochondrial dysfunction, increasing the production of reactive oxygen species, which then create oxidative damage within the very microenvironments where stem cells reside and are meant to be nurtured. Each step in this chain has been measured, and each link has been demonstrated in human tissue. This isn't a theoretical pathway, it's a documented series of events likely occurring in individuals carrying the chronic stress load that modern life encourages us to normalize. Now, I want to address a finding that I believe will surprise the most people in this audience. It's not the sleep research or the stress data. It's something you might have purchased at the grocery store this week, perhaps while actively trying to eat well: ultra-processed foods. I want to be precise because the term ultra-processed is often used loosely and incorrectly applied only to obvious junk food, fast food, candy, and chips. That framing completely misses the point and might be why you've been unknowingly consuming these foods while believing you were protecting yourself. The formal classification system used by researchers, called the NOVA system, defines ultra-processed foods not by their nutritional content, but by the extent of industrial transformation they have undergone. An ultra-processed food is one that has been broken down from its original whole food matrix, combined with industrial additives like emulsifiers, colorants, flavor enhancers, modified starches, and texturizers, and then reassembled into a product that resembles whole food but isn't. By this definition, the following items are considered ultra-processed: packaged whole grain bread, even the kind labeled 100% whole wheat; commercial fruit yogurts, including those marketed as probiotic and health-forward; brand name granola, nearly every protein bar currently sold in the United States; most commercial plant-based milks that contain gums, oils, or added synthetic vitamins; breakfast cereals, including those marketed as low sugar and heart healthy. If you looked at your breakfast this morning and felt confident it was healthy, there's a reasonable chance that a portion of it was ultra-processed by this definition. 2 studies published in 2024, both large and rigorous, quantified the impact of chronic consumption of these foods on the rate of biological aging, measured not by how old you feel, but by validated biomarkers in your blood. The first study, from the Multani study in Italy, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in December 2024, involved 22,495 participants. Esposito and colleagues found that high consumption of ultra-processed foods was significantly associated with accelerated biological aging as measured by circulating biomarkers in the blood. This was not a marginal association, but a statistically robust one in a sample large enough to have substantial statistical power. The second study utilized NCHANE's data, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, witnessed which provides the closest thing to a nationally representative sample of American adults. Published in H and Aging in November 2024 by Cardoso, Lowe, Machado, and colleagues from Monash University and Columbia University, it found that for every 10% increase in the proportion of daily calories coming from ultra-processed foods, the gap between your biological age and your chronological age increased by 2.4 months. Let that sink in. 10%. If 40% of your daily calories come from ultra-processed foods, which is actually below the American average according to CDC data, you may be carrying the equivalent of roughly 10 months of additional biological aging compared to someone eating the same total calories from minimally processed whole foods. If you're at 50%, which epidemiological data suggests is typical, the math becomes considerably more concerning. The Nachane's paper was careful to note that this association was partially independent of overall diet quality, suggesting that the degree of industrial processing itself, not just the macronutrient composition, is driving the aging acceleration. The mechanism isn't mysterious, even if the details are still being refined. Ultra-processed foods consistently alter the gut microbiome in ways that increase intestinal permeability, trigger low-level immune activation, and elevate markers of systemic inflammation, specifically interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and C-reactive protein. This state of chronic low-grade inflammation, sometimes referred to as inflammaging in gerontology literature, is directly hostile to stem cell function. Stem cells don't exist in isolation. They reside in carefully maintained microenvironments called niches. These niches are extremely sensitive to inflammatory signals. When a niche is chronically inflamed, stem cells shift from a state of productive maintenance to a state of stress response. They either exhaust themselves trying to compensate or enter senescence, a state of suspended function. We'll revisit senescence, as it's the convergence point for all four stressors we're discussing today. Now, I want to address the fourth habit. This is the one I was most personally reluctant to discuss, because it runs counter to a message that many physicians, including myself for a long time, have been consistently giving patients for decades. Excessive cardiovascular exercise without adequate recovery is a stem cell stressor. Let me be absolutely clear. I am emphatically not saying that exercise is bad for your stem cells. The evidence points precisely to the opposite. A landmark study published in Cell Stem Cell in April 2023 from research teams at Stanford University and Baylor College of Medicine conducted single-cell RNA sequencing on over 435,000 individual cells across multiple tissues in young and aged mice. This extraordinary level of resolution produced what is now the most comprehensive atlas ever published on how exercise affects the stem cell landscape in the aging body. The conclusion was clear. Moderate aerobic exercise reduces inflammatory signatures in muscle stem cells, neural stem cells, and hematopoietic stem cells simultaneously, and restores intercellular communication patterns characteristic of younger organisms. Exercise, done correctly, is one of the most powerful protective interventions for stem cell function in the aging body that we know of. The problem arises when exercise stops being moderate, when recovery is insufficient, and when the intensity and frequency are high enough that the body never fully returns to baseline between sessions before being stressed again. In that scenario, exercise shifts from being a signal for adaptation to becoming a chronic stressor. Cortisol remains elevated for longer than the body requires. Reactive oxygen species accumulate faster than the body's antioxidant systems can neutralize them. And the muscle stem cells, known as satellite cells in the literature, which are supposed to repair the microdamage from exercise and build adaptive capacity, begin to show the same signs of exhaustion seen in other chronic stress contexts, the same cell stem cell. Paper explicitly notes that aged muscle stem cells are already more prone to cell death, senescence, and loss of myogenic potential than young ones. Overtraining in a 55 or 65-year-old isn't just a performance issue. It may be accelerating the depletion of the cellular machinery that maintains muscle mass, supports recovery from injury, and sustains physical independence over the long arc of aging. The pattern I often see clinically in patients who come in frustrated that their bodies aren't responding as they used to, despite their discipline and consistency, is this: they are doing too much steady state or high intensity cardio, not enough resistance training, and not nearly enough recovery. They have confused volume with benefit, and their bodies at a cellular level are paying a price that doesn't show up on a scale or in a performance metric, but accumulates over years in the form of accelerated muscle loss, slower recovery from illness and injury, and a body that seems to be aging faster than their lifestyle should explain. Now, I want to explain the mechanism that ties all four of these stressors together. Disrupted sleep, chronic cortisol, ultra-processed foods, and excessive exercise without recovery do not damage your stem cells through four separate, unrelated pathways. They converge, they amplify each other, and the convergence point is a process called cellular senescence. When a stem cell is chronically stressed by cortisol, by oxidative damage, by inflammatory cytokines from a disrupted gut microbiome, or by the accumulated failure of nightly epigenetic maintenance, it eventually reaches a threshold where it stops dividing and enters a dormant state. This is cellular senescence, and here's the part that's rarely explained clearly. Senescent cells don't just quietly stop working, they begin secreting a cocktail of inflammatory molecules. Researchers call this the SASP, the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. This secretory profile acts on neighboring cells, promoting their senescence as well. It's a self-amplifying loop. Stress creates senescent stem cells create more inflammation, and more inflammation stresses the remaining functional stem cells, which accelerates their senescence. A finding referenced in a comprehensive 2025 review of hematopoietic stem cell aging makes this particularly concrete. The research found that even transient inflammatory exposures, not chronic ones but single significant inflammatory events that fully resolved, could produce lasting reductions in functional hematopoietic stem cells. A year after the inflammation was gone, the bone marrow had not fully recovered its stem cell capacity. The system doesn't forgive and forget easily. The choices you are making now about how you manage sleep, how you handle chronic stress, what you eat, and how hard you push in exercise are not just affecting how you feel this week. They are shaping the stem cell reserve your body will have available for the next decade and beyond. Let me take a moment to draw these four mechanisms together in a way that makes the practical picture clearer. Think of your stem cell reserve as a savings account. You were born with a certain balance, and your body has been slowly drawing on it since birth to fund its daily repair and maintenance. Operations. By 50, that balance is already significantly lower than it was at 25. That's not a disease, that's biology. But whether that balance continues to decline at a normal rate or begins accelerating towards zero depends enormously on the environment you create for those cells day in and day out. Poor sleep is not restoring the account, it's actively restructuring it in ways that make the existing balance less functional and less reliable. Chronic stress is like a high-fee account, draining a small but constant percentage of what's there. Ultra-processed foods are contaminating the environment around the account, making every withdrawal more costly and less precise. Excessive exercise without recovery is making withdrawals that are too large, too frequently, before the account has had time to replenish. Those four things together, especially in combination, create a trajectory. And the trajectory isn't predetermined, it is modifiable. The research showing that fasting refeeding cycles can restore aged hematopoietic stem cells to near youthful function is important precisely because it demonstrates the plasticity that remains in this system at almost any age. Your stem cells are not simply counting down, they are responding to signals right now, and the signals you send them through your daily choices are far more powerful than most people, including most physicians, have been taught to appreciate. Here's what I want you to do with this information. Before anything else, understand that I am sharing a framework, not a prescription. Some of what follows will require a conversation with your doctor, particularly if you are on medications, have specific diagnoses, or are considering supplement protocols. Everything I am about to recommend has peer-reviewed evidence behind it. None of it is conjecture. I will tell you clearly where the evidence is stronger and where it is more preliminary. As always, if you have any significant health conditions or take any medications, please speak with your physician before implementing the changes I am about to describe. This is the standard for responsible medicine, and I am not going to set it aside for the sake of sounding authoritative. The first and highest priority intervention, if you take nothing else from this conversation, is sleep quality and consistency. Not just quantity, though quantity matters. Consistency. The Harvard epigenomics paper is clear that the circadian system, the internal biological clock that governs stem cell maintenance, responds to regularity more than to almost any other variable. Your stem cells are expecting sleep at a predictable time. Disrupting that expectation, even on weekends, compounds over time. Pick a time to go to bed and pick a time to wake up. Hold those times 7 days a week, including weekends, for at least 4 weeks, and then evaluate how you feel. Most people who do this report a qualitative change in morning alertness within 10 to 14 days. Not dramatic, but subtle and different. For the environmental setup, your room temperature for sleep should be in the range of 65 to 68 degrees, 18 to 20 degrees. This is the range in which deep, slow-wave sleep, the most restorative phase and the one that declines most sharply with age, is most readily accessible. Complete darkness matters more than most people realize. Melatonin production in people over 50 is already substantially lower than in younger adults, and any light exposure during the sleep window further suppresses the residual production. Regarding caffeine, the metabolic clearance of caffeine slows significantly with age. In a 20-year-old, the biological half-life of caffeine runs roughly 4 to 5 hours. In someone over 50, it may be 8, 9, or 10 hours, depending on genetics and liver function. A coffee at 2 p.m. may still have meaningful physiological activity at midnight. The practical guideline I give patients is no caffeine after 1 p.m. Try it for 2 weeks before deciding whether it makes a difference for you specifically. If you suspect sleep apnea, which is substantially underdiagnosed in this age group and particularly in women, address that before anything else. Fragmented sleep from undiagnosed apnea overrides every other intervention. You cannot optimize stem cell maintenance through sleep if the sleep itself is being interrupted dozens of times per hour by apnea events. The second priority is restructuring how you exercise, not necessarily reducing it. The Cell Stem Cell 2023 Atlas study is explicit about the intensity range that produces stem cell benefits. Moderate aerobic exercise, what exercise physiology calls zone 2. This is the intensity at which you can hold a conversation but are breathing noticeably harder than at rest. At this intensity, the research shows you are improving mitochondrial function, reducing systemic inflammation, and stimulating the intercellular communication patterns associated with younger biology, without generating the sustained cortisol elevation and oxidative burden that come with higher intensity efforts too frequently. The target from the evidence base is approximately 150 minutes per week of Zone 2 exercise. For most people, this means 3 to 5 sessions of 30 to 45 minutes at a brisk walking, cycling, or swimming pace, the kind where you could narrate a podcast but wouldn't want to give a speech. The other critical component, and this is particularly important for muscle stem cell health, is resistance training. 2 to 3 sessions per week, targeting all major muscle groups. Resistance training is the most potent cellular signal we know of for keeping muscle satellite cells active and functional as we age. The loss of muscle mass that most people attribute simply to getting older is, at the cellular level, significantly driven by the declining activity of muscle stem cells. Resistance training is the intervention with the strongest evidence for reversing that decline. What I am asking you to consider pulling back from is not exercise itself, but excessive high-intensity, steady-state cardio performed without adequate recovery. If you are training intensely 5 or 6 days a week, if your resting heart rate is trending upward over months, if you are waking up more fatigued than when you went to sleep, if your performance metrics are declining despite your effort, these are biological signals that your exercise has crossed the line from stimulus to chronic stressor. The stem cell biology at that point is not working in your favor, even if your discipline is admirable. The third priority is food, specifically auditing what you are actually eating for ultra-processed content, including and especially the foods you believe are healthy. Here's the practical test. Read the ingredient list on your bread. If it contains more than 5 or 6 ingredients, and if those ingredients include words you wouldn't find in a home kitchen, words like modified starch, soy lecithin, datum, calcium propionate, mono, and diglycerides, you are eating an ultra-processed food, regardless of what the front of the package says. The same test applies to your yogurt. Plain, full-fat yogurt with live cultures and no additives is not ultra-processed. Commercial yogurt with added fruit preparations, thickeners, sweeteners, and a 7-ingredient label most certainly is. The same principle applies to granola, to protein bars, to most commercial cereals, and to nearly every packaged snack food that deploys health language on its front panel. The practical intervention here is not perfection, and it's not a wholesale dietary overhaul. What the N-Chain's 2024 study tells us is that every 10% shift away from ultra-processed foods and toward minimally processed whole foods matters. It matters in ways that are measurable in your blood. Start with the highest frequency items in your diet and find minimally processed replacements. Swap packaged granola for rolled oats prepared with fruit and nuts. Swap commercial fruit yogurt for plain Greek yogurt with actual berries added by you. Swap the protein bar for a small handful of mixed nuts and a piece of fruit. These sound like incremental changes, but compounded across weeks, months, and years, they are exactly the kind of shifts that the biological aging data suggests makes a meaningful, measurable difference. For the broader dietary pattern, the evidence consistently points towards several categories of food that support the cellular environment stem cells need, and leafy green vegetables. Spinach, kale, arugula, consumed daily, provide folate and other cofactors essential for DNA synthesis and repair, the exact processes that stem cells rely on for their maintenance and self-renewal. Fatty fish. Salmon, sardines, mackerel, 2 to 3 times per week provides EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids that reduce the systemic inflammatory tone we've identified as one of the primary environmental threats to stem cell niches. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, black beans, 4 to 5 times per week supply the prebiotic fiber that feeds the gut microbiome, which in turn modulates systemic inflammatory signaling. Berries, particularly blueberries, are among the most potent dietary sources of polyphenol compounds that counter the oxidative stress we've been discussing. What you are building with this pattern is not just a more favorable macronutrient ratio. You are creating a systemic inflammation level, a gut microbiome composition, a metabolic and oxidative environment in which stem cell niches can maintain their function rather than being constantly activated into defensive responses. The fourth priority, and I want to be clear that it's not less important, but rather comes fourth because it's often the hardest to act on independently of the others, is chronic stress management, specifically the goal of reducing sustained cortisol elevation. The intervention with the most consistent scientific evidence behind it is mindfulness meditation, practiced consistently for 10 to 20 minutes daily. I'm aware that this recommendation meets resistance from some people who consider themselves too practical or too skeptical for it. What I would ask is that you set that skepticism aside temporarily and look at what the measurements actually show. Research, including work by Elizabeth and Elisa Appel at UCSF, has measured the effect of sustained meditation practice on cortisol levels and on telomerase activity, the enzyme that protects and maintains telomere length. Regular meditators show measurably reduced cortisol and measurably increased telomerase activity compared to non-meditating controls. The mechanism isn't mystical, it's the physiological consequence of repeatedly activating the parasympathetic nervous system and dampening down the HPA axis. The fact that the practice feels simple or even counterintuitively unsophisticated doesn't change what it does at the molecular level. Time in natural outdoor environments is another intervention that is supported by more rigorous data than its simplicity suggests. Consistent research shows that 20 or more minutes spent in green space, a park, a trail, a garden, produces measurable reductions in cortisol and shifts in autonomic nervous system tone from sympathetic toward parasympathetic dominance. The HPA axis evolved in an environment that included substantial time outdoors. There is legitimate evidence that the chronic absence of that context functions as a low-grade stressor in its own right. I also want to address, because patients ask me regularly, the role of sleep quality in stress management, not just as a downstream problem, but as a direct cortisol regulator. One of the most robust relationships in HPA literature is between poor sleep and elevated morning cortisol. This is part of why sleep is the first priority. Improving sleep directly reduces cortisol, which reduces stem cell stress, which reduces the senescence cascade, which reduces the inflammatory environment, which in turn makes it easier to sleep. These systems are coupled, and the coupling works in both directions. Now, I want to spend some time on a topic that the research on is genuinely exciting about, which is intermittent fasting. And I want to handle it carefully because the evidence is compelling in some contexts and requires caution in others. Research from MIT's KO Institute, led by Yilmaz and colleagues and published in Cell Stem Cell, showed that a 24-hour fasting period doubled the regenerative capacity of intestinal stem cells in both young and aged mice. The mechanism was activation of fatty acid oxidation pathways regulated by PPAR transcription factors. Essentially, the fast forces stem cells to switch their metabolic fuel source in a way that enhances their regenerative function. The effect was present in aged animals as well as young ones, which is the critical point for our audience. A 2024 study from Columbia University added a remarkable finding. Fasting refeeding cycles, meaning deliberate alternation between periods of caloric restriction and normal eating, appear to activate autophagy in aged hematopoietic stem cells and substantially restore their function toward what you would measure in young animals. These are not marginal improvements. They are the kind of functional restoration that suggests significant biological plasticity remains in the aged stem cell system. However, and this is a meaningful however, research from MIT published in Nature in 2024 identified that the refeeding phase following a fast may increase the rate of intestinal cell proliferation in a way that could elevate risk in individuals with pre-existing cancerous mutations in the intestinal epithelium. The context in which fasting is safe and clearly beneficial is not identical for everyone. If you have a personal or family history of colorectal cancer, if you have had intestinal polyps at any point, if you are at elevated risk for gastrointestinal malignancy, please have a specific conversation with your gastroenterologist before implementing any fasting protocol. This is not a reason to dismiss the evidence for fasting. It's a reason to be context aware about it. For people without those contraindications, without a history of feeding disorders, not on insulin or sulfonylurea class diabetes medications, and at a healthy weight, a moderate intermittent fasting approach appears consistent with the biology. The 16-8 protocol, a 16-hour overnight fast and an 8-hour eating window, practiced 3 to 4 days per week rather than every day, is the approach I have found most sustainable for patients in this age group. A practical implementation: finish eating by 7 p.m. and have breakfast at 11 a.m. the following morning. That's a 16-hour fast without significantly disrupting social patterns. If you want to start more conservatively, a 14-hour fast, finishing at 7 p.m. and starting at 9 a.m. is a reasonable entry point that allows your physiology to adapt before extending the window. On supplements, I want to be direct because the market here is substantial and largely not grounded in the evidence we've been discussing. There is no oral supplement currently available that has been demonstrated in rigorous human clinical trials to specifically and safely activate adult stem cells. Products marketed with that language are not backed by peer-reviewed literature. If you encounter a stem cell activator supplement, the claim on the label is not supported by the science I am aware of. There are, however, specific micronutrients with legitimate evidence for supporting the cellular processes we have described. Vitamin D3 is the most important of them. Deficiency is extraordinarily common in adults over 50, and vitamin D plays a direct role in immune cell differentiation and inflammatory regulation, both of which are tied to stem cell niche health. I recommend measuring your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level. A level below 30 nanograms per milliliter is deficient by most clinical definitions. The range supported by functional outcome data, not just deficiency prevention, is roughly 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter. Supplementation to achieve that range typically requires somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 IU daily, though individual variation is significant, and some people, particularly those who spend little time outdoors, need more. The only way to know where you are is to measure. Magnesium is substantially underappreciated in this context. It's a cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions, including several directly involved in DNA repair, which is the process that protects stem cells from the accumulation of genetic damage we've discussed. Magnesium deficiency is common in people who consume a high proportion of ultra-processed foods, partly because industrial food processing removes much of the magnesium from raw ingredients. Magnesium citrate or magnesium glycinate in the range of 300 to 400 milliliters daily is well tolerated by most people. Note, if you take certain antibiotics, take magnesium with a 2-hour separation to avoid impairing antibiotic absorption. Omega-3 fatty acids from a high-quality fish oil targeting 1 to 3 grams of combined EPA and DHA daily have the most consistent human evidence for reducing the systemic inflammation markers we've identified as directly hostile to stem cell niches. If you are on anticoagulant therapy, discuss this with your physician before starting, as high-dose omega-3s have a modest anticoagulant effect. One caution on antioxidants specifically: I will not recommend high-dose isolated antioxidant supplements, e.g. vitamin C above 2 grams daily, vitamin E above 400 international units daily. The intuition that more antioxidants neutralize more oxidative damage sounds logical. However, there is growing evidence that stem cells actually require a certain level of reactive oxygen species as signaling molecules for proper function and differentiation. Flooding the system with isolated high-dose antioxidants may interfere with that signaling. Antioxidants from whole foods, berries, vegetables, green tea do not create this concern because they arrive in complex matrices with natural dose constraints. I want to address what monitoring looks like because one of the most common questions I get from patients who are making these changes is, how do I know if this is working? The standard blood work I consider most informative for tracking the cellular aging picture we've been discussing includes a complete blood count, CBC, which reflects the output quality of your hematopoietic stem cells in a practical and accessible way. If your CBC shows patterns of anemia, reduced platelet counts, or abnormal white cell differentials that are not fully explained by other causes, that's worth investigating as a possible stem cell signal. High-sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP, is the most widely available marker of systemic inflammation. A reading below 1.0 mgl represents a low inflammatory state. Most people who make consistent progress on sleep quality, dietary pattern, and stress management see this number fall meaningfully over a period of 3 to 6 months. Hemoglobin A1C reflects the glycemic environment your cells are living in and is worth tracking quarterly if you are making metabolic changes. Ashrater quartz. 25-hydroxy vitamin D level. Because maintaining the 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter window matters and fluctuates seasonally for most people in northern latitudes. Ferritin, which reflects iron storage and is closely tied to hematopoietic function. Iron deficiency is common in this age group, and is often missed because a frank anemia has not yet developed, even though the stem cell stress from iron insufficiency is real. Wearable technology that tracks resting heart rate and heart rate variability over time is generally useful as a proxy for recovery status and autonomic nervous system health. Resting heart rate creeping upward over weeks, despite maintaining or reducing exercise load, is a signal worth paying attention to. Heart rate variability declining over time is one of the clearest wearable indicators that the cumulative load of sleep disruption, unmanaged stress, and exercise demand is pushing the system toward a state of chronic strain. You don't need to optimize these numbers obsessively, but tracking them provides a kind of biological feedback that was simply not available to previous generations, and it's worth using. What does a reasonable timeline look like? In the first 2 weeks, the most common shift people notice is subjective and subtle. A different quality of morning alertness. Not dramatically better, necessarily, but different in character. A little more subtle, a little less like you're fighting against the morning. If you are simultaneously reducing ultra-processed foods, expect the first 3 to 5 days to involve stronger than usual food cravings because the flavor engineering in those products is sophisticated and deliberate. The cravings will pass. The biology on the other side of them is quieter and more stable. By the end of the first month, blood markers that respond relatively quickly begin to move in people who have made meaningful changes in both sleep and dietary patterns. High sensitivity CRP, in particular, tends to be one of the earlier responders. Many people also report that exercise recovery feels meaningfully different, that the same workout leaves them less depleted the following morning. At the 2 to 3 month mark, this is typically when metabolic changes become visible in standard blood work. Fasting glucose and HbA1c respond on this timescale if meaningful dietary changes have been made. Body composition changes become visible to external measures. Muscle mass responds slowly but measurably to consistent resistance training, even in people who had come to believe that muscle loss in their 60s was simply inevitable. The changes that reflect actual stem cell biology rather than downstream symptoms take longer to measure, and most of us don't have access to the specialized assays used in research settings. What you are likely to notice over the 1 to 2 year range of consistent implementation, if you implement it consistently, is a pattern rather than a single dramatic improvement. Fewer and shorter illness episodes because the immune output of healthier hematopoietic stem cells is more responsive and more precise. Better recovery from physical effort because muscle satellite cells are more functional. Wounds that heal more cleanly. A quality of physical resilience that doesn't show up as peak performance but as a baseline that simply does not keep declining the way it was declining before. The research that I find most intellectually striking in everything I reviewed for this conversation is not about damage, it's about the capacity for restoration. The Columbia 2024 work showing that fasting refeeding cycles could almost normalize the function of aged hematopoietic stem cells toward what you see in young animals is significant, not as a practical prescription, but as a proof of principle. The aging stem cell system retains far more plasticity than the field understood even 5 years ago. Your stem cells are not passively counting down to a fixed endpoint. They are responding to signals from their environment right now, and the environment you create through daily choices is a genuinely powerful variable. There are some things I want to be honest about in the spirit of not overstating the certainty of the evidence. Many of the studies we discussed today, the MIT fasting work, the Columbia stem cell restoration findings, the Cell Stem Cell Exercise Atlas, used animal models. The translation to human biology is supported by mechanistic plausibility and by human epidemiological data showing consistent patterns, but the rigorous controlled trials in human subjects that would let us state specific quantitative predictions with certainty have not all been done. When I tell you that Zone 2 exercise protects stem cells, I am extrapolating from an extraordinarily detailed biological atlas that used animal models informed by human exercise, physiology data, and population-level associations. conclusions. The evidence is coherent and substantial. It's not identical to having a 30-year randomized controlled trial in humans that measured stem cell counts as a primary endpoint. What this means practically is that the interventions I've described are consistent with the best available evidence and have excellent general health rationale independent of their stem cell effects. Better sleep, reduced ultra-processed food consumption, appropriate exercise, managed chronic stress, these would be beneficial recommendations regardless of the stem cell data. The stem cell research adds a mechanistic understanding of why they matter so specifically in this age group and with this degree of urgency. It does not require you to suspend judgment or accept speculative claims. The foundation is solid. I also want to be honest that there is individual variation in all of this. The same dietary change that meaningfully reduces HSCRP in one person may produce a smaller effect in another, depending on genetics, microbiome composition, metabolic history, and dozens of other variables that population-level studies smooth over. The target is not to perfectly replicate a research protocol. The target is directional. Move consistently away from the habits that the evidence identifies as harmful and move consistently toward the ones identified as protective, and then use your own measurable biomarkers and your own subjective experience of energy, recovery, and resilience to calibrate over time. There is one more thing I want to say before we close. People in their 50s and 60s have grown up in a medical culture that largely treated aging as something to manage and slow at best, but not meaningfully reverse. The framing was fundamentally passive. These things decline. We try to minimize the rate of decline. We accept the rest. What the emerging science of stem cell biology is beginning to offer is a fundamentally different frame. The declines we associate with aging in immune function, muscle maintenance, tissue repair, and metabolic resilience are substantially, though not entirely, driven by the condition of a cell population that is responsive to its environment. Change the environment, and the population responds. There is not a promise of immortality or a cure for aging. The biology is more complex and more humbling than that, but it is a meaningful shift in agency. The habits we have discussed today are not marginal lifestyle optimizations. At the cellular level, they are signals that either support or undermine the system your body most depends on for the repairs and adaptations that determine how well and how independently you age. I spent years sending the wrong signals because I did not know what I know now, and because the information was not easy to find or clearly communicated. That is the reason I do this, and it is why these conversations matter to me. If you found this useful, the video on mitochondrial function and aging in the description links directly to the mechanisms we covered today and goes deeper on the energy production side of cellular aging. I think you will find that it adds a significant layer to what we discussed here. Leave a comment with what surprised you most or the habit you are going to address first. Those comments generally shape what I research next. I read everyone. Keep investigating. Keep asking hard questions of the information you receive, including from me.